Well, thank you all, and it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to come and to speak to you today. And I'd like to pay particular tribute to Bruce Ritchie for the work that he's done in organising this conference. I think it's a very worthwhile event, and I think was much appreciated yesterday, and I trust will be again today. So thank you, and a pleasure to speak to you. So the Covenanters and the Glorious Revolution, a fascinating, a radical time of change. We're just taking a little 3-year window in the history of Scotland, and yet 3 years in which Scotland's constitutional settlement, in which Scotland's church was radically transformed, and therefore a time that I think is well worthy of particular attention. And the Covenanters and the Glorious Revolution, because, of course, the revolution in terms of Scotland particularly occurred against the background of the Covenanters, of the killing times, and of the conflicts of the 17th century Kirk. So hopefully bringing together history that is familiar to us, but also hopefully some new aspects to it as well. In particular, what I find interesting about history is how it shatters our expectations, how when we really dig into subjects, we find interesting things that don't match up with our prejudices or our preconceptions, and certainly we'll find that today. So let's begin by speaking a little about the Glorious Revolution itself. The revolution was not, in fact, Scottish at all. It was an English achievement, and specifically an Anglican achievement. And there straight away you have one of your preconceptions shattered, because our perception, of course, of the Church of England at this time is a quiescent, conformist church, a church thoroughly subject to the crown, having taken the oath. Here were the ministers not who had gone out courageously in the Great Ejection, the Puritans willing to take their stand against the primacy of Charles II, the monarch, in the church, but those who had stayed in, those who had conformed, those who had been subject to the will of the king. And yet ultimately it was the Church of England that challenged James VII and II, that saw him as a threat to the future of the Reformation in the British Isles. And ultimately, it was really an Anglican achievement to challenge James and ultimately to topple him from the throne. So the bishops of the Church of England stood against James. They won the support of the overwhelming bulk of the people. James attempted a show trial and was, of course, defeated in that. The bishops were acquitted, and with James's moral authority destroyed, the English peers sent to Holland for William and Mary. And so they landed at Torbay in Devon, about as far from Scotland as you can get without a boat. Torbay in Devon, and from there they began their effective bloodless conquest of the British Isles. So we're directing our attention to Scotland, which is merely an observer, an onlooker upon these dramatic events, and yet which is going to be so dramatically affected by what happened there. So firstly, let's consider the Covenanters. Now, the challenge we have in coming to this topic is how then do we define the Covenanters? Because, of course, the National Covenant, when it was taken by the Scottish nation, the Scottish Church as a whole. Support for it in 1638, 1643 was overwhelming. So how then do we define Covenanters when we come to this later period? Some of the Covenanters had conformed, had become ministers of the Episcopalian Church of Scotland, and were subject to the rule of the bishops. Others had refused to conform to episcopacy, had remained firmly Presbyterian, but had been willing to accept indulgences from the Stuart monarchs. There had been 3 successive indulgences, and so some of the Covenanters had been willing to compromise to that degree, whereby their Presbyterian worship was simply carried out by means of accepting royal indulgence. Others, who were arguably the mainstream of the Covenanting movement, were those who refused to accept the indulgence, who continued to maintain worship privately and covertly, but who avoided any political edge. They were not indulged ministers, but nor were they engaging in a political rebellion. They were not attempting to topple the monarch. And I would suggest that if we're talking about Covenanters, then I would suggest that that body represents really the mainstream of the Covenanting movement. And then you get the real extremists, who were the United Societies, who were particularly strong in the southwest of Scotland. And these United Societies, who had 3 ministers by the end of 1688, these societies were rejecting the legitimacy of the reign of the Stuart kings and were demanding that the king be deposed. So they were effectively in active political and sometimes military rebellion against the Stuart monarchs. So we see a spectrum of Covenanting, but it's important to remember that the hardliners, the extremists, those who were actually at the point of political rebellion, were certainly a minority within the wider Covenanting movement. So it is not accurate to describe the Covenanters simply in terms of the United Societies. To come up to the Highlands specifically, we have some interesting characters even from this locality. One who's often forgotten was Angus MacBean, who was the parish minister of Inverness, ministering in a church on the site of what is now the Old High Church, an 18th century building. MacBean had been, of course, ordained as an Episcopalian and had been settled in Inverness after a pastorate in Ayr as the Episcopalian minister of the town. But he himself came round to Presbyterian convictions, and eventually in 1687, so just before this period, he had withdrawn from the establishment and had started to hold private services along Presbyterian lines in private houses for those who would attend his ministry in Inverness and elsewhere. For this offence, he was arrested. He was interrogated by the Scottish Privy Council, and then he was imprisoned in the Tolbooth. And there he remained for most of 1688. And by the time he was finally released, his health had broken and he died shortly after. So there was one who was not in any sense a political rebel, but who certainly was a Covenanter and in his own way a martyr for the cause. Another was, of course, Thomas Hogg of Kiltern, Presbyterian minister of Kiltern prior to the Restoration. That's the rural district around the village of Eventon. Thomas Hogg was a particularly courageous Covenanter, going around preaching, ministering privately, at last arrested for this, imprisoned in the Bass Rock near Edinburgh, and then eventually forced into exile. He went to the Netherlands, and in fact there befriended William of Orange and was one of his chaplains in the Netherlands. Another important name was John McKillican, who was the old Presbyterian minister of Fodderty, very near to Dingwall. McKillican, again, a very courageous Covenanter who maintained services in this area and most notably led the great Covenanting communion at Obsdale near Alness in 1680, which is now commemorated by the memorial there. By this later stage, McKillican had actually erected a private place of worship on his own land in Alness, and so people were actually attending Presbyterian worship in McKillican's own private chapel. So there were those, even in this area, who were maintaining Covenanting worship, and that only multiplies as you go further south, and especially to the Covenanting heartlands of the southwest of Scotland. So we come, secondly, to consider the events that followed. And we'll take them year by year. So we'll start with 1688, the events of 1688, and follow the course of the revolution. So we begin, of course, down in England, as I have emphasised. The events of 1688. King James looked unassailable. He had behind him the whole power of the British state, and there was no question as to the legitimacy of his crown, except by this tiny minority of very hardline Covenanters who had neither the power, nor the military strength, nor the prestige to present any effective challenge. He looked unassailable, but in fact his authority was fragile. He was a Roman Catholic monarch within a Protestant country, and what was most troubling to his subjects was that James was evidently working to extend the interests of the Roman Catholic Church within the British Isles. He'd actually had set up in the palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh a printing press which was being used to disseminate Roman Catholic works, and he had permitted the Jesuits to make their base in Holyrood House and had granted them an indulgence so that legally they could work to evangelise, to lead worship, and to propagate their tenets in Scotland. So James was evidently working to advance Roman Catholicism in Scotland openly, more covertly in England, and all of this was serving to undermine his reign. But two particular events followed in the early course of 1688, which brought his reign to an effective close. The first was the birth of a son, James Francis Edward, who was born on the 10th of June, 1688. This was a particularly shocking development. Up until that point, James had been seen as a Roman Catholic monarch, but with two Protestant daughters, Mary, married to William of Orange, Anne, married to George of Denmark. Protestant princesses with Protestant husbands, and therefore it seemed that the Protestant succession to the throne was secured. But now a son had been born. Under the rules of primogeniture, the son would inherit rather than the Protestant daughters, and this son would be raised a Roman Catholic. So the prospect, therefore, was of a permanent Roman Catholic dynasty ruling the British Isles. The situation was therefore changed completely and radically by the birth of this child. James's Romanism could no longer be considered just a private matter, just a temporary circumstance. But the second event, and what really undermined James, was the legal case that was fought over the Declaration of Indulgence. And this was exclusively an English matter. The declaration James had issued in 1687 had granted freedom of worship to dissenters across England. It was, of course, appreciated by the many English nonconformists, those who were Puritans by background, who stood outside of the established church. But of course, it was not for their benefit, it was for the benefit of the Roman Catholics. And all knew that the king's purpose was to promote the advance of Romanism. When the king reissued this declaration in 1688, he commanded that it be read from the pulpit of every congregation of the Church of England. The result of this demand was a protest from 7 bishops of the Anglican Church, who protested both against the declaration and against the reading of it. For them, the prospect of open toleration of Romanism was exceedingly dangerous and brought with it the prospect that the Reformation was going to be overturned in the British Isles altogether. James was furious at this challenge to his authority and brought a charge of seditious libel against the 7 bishops for publishing their protest. The prosecution failed, and the result of this was a situation of political catastrophe for James. There was widespread open public sympathy for the bishops. They were eventually acquitted of James's charge on the 30th of June 1688, and James's authority was publicly destroyed. He had been defied by his own church, the conformist Church of England. And in fact, that very same day, the day of the acquittal, the Lords of England, the peers, sent a covert invitation to William of Orange to come to England and to take the crown. When William landed at Torbay in Devon on the 5th of November, he was greeted with relief on all sides, not with opposition, and in fact he entered London entirely without bloodshed. James escaped abroad, and it seemed to all that the kingdom of England had effectively been abandoned by its monarch, and that the crown was therefore vacant. So Scotland, up until this point, has been merely an onlooker to events, but of course James was Scotland's monarch as well, and James's flight to the continent left a vacuum of power for Scotland just the same. The Lord Chancellor of Scotland was the Earl of Perth, a ruthless Roman Catholic and persecutor of the Covenanters. He fled from Edinburgh after being assaulted by a mob in December of 1688. The mob went on to assault Holyrood House itself, to smash up the Roman Catholic chapel that James had adorned there, destroy the printing press, and also destroy the Jesuit school that had been set up within the palace. The books, the beads, the crosses, the idolatrous images were all burnt in the street. Lord Perth himself was captured shortly afterwards, trying to flee on board a ship to the continent dressed as a woman, and he was thrown into the common prison in Kirkcaldy. So it was a situation of a vacuum of power as 1688 ended and 1689 began. Scotland was now without a king, but it was also without a Lord Chancellor. It was therefore a very dangerous time. There was a very real prospect of civil war on the horizon. Did William have the support in Scotland to claim the Scottish crown as well, or would Scotland remain loyal to the departed King James? But for the Covenanters, of course, it was a glorious movement. They had survived the killing times, and now here was a prospect of freedom and of deliverance from persecution. The Romanist king who they had opposed had now fled. The Covenanters who had denounced James's rule now saw him defeated. And so for them, it was a time of joy and of relief. On the 25th of December, the members of the United Societies gathered to proclaim their support for the Protestant protector, William of Orange, and in particular, they welcomed William's declaration to the people of Scotland, in which he offered them his rule. This gathering was led by the Covenanting minister, William Boyd, and was probably the first public response to the declaration. So the very hardest line Covenanters were certainly glad to welcome William. William's declaration to the people of Scotland had explicitly condemned the Stuart king's policy of persecution, recalling the destruction of the poor people by hanging, shooting, and drowning them without any form of law or respect to sex or age. So William, therefore, clearly distancing himself from the policy of persecution, and therefore, as a result, the Covenanters were glad to welcome him. On 4th January 1689, the United Societies gathered for worship at Douglas in Lanarkshire. Their minister, Alexander Shields, expounded to them Psalm 76. In Judah's land, God is well known. His name is in Israel great. The context was, of course, the thanksgiving for God's deliverance of his people, and it therefore seemed very apt to the Covenanters. Indeed, Mr. Shields, in commenting on the psalm, reminded the people that when the Spanish Armada had been defeated in 1588, the Covenanting minister Robert Bruce had sung that psalm at the cross of Edinburgh. From heaven thou judgment cause be heard, the earth was still with fear when God to judgment rose to save all meek on earth that were. So it was an uneasy peace that continued through the early months of 1689. All sides were waiting for news from England because that was where the crucial events were happening. On 13th February 1689, William and Mary jointly accepted the crown of England from the English Parliament, and a convention of the Estates of Scotland was summoned for the 14th of March. This would effectively work as a Scottish Parliament. It would be a representative body of the ruling classes of Scotland and would decide the future of the Scottish kingdom. On the 2nd of March, so just a couple of weeks before, the United Societies gathered in vast numbers at Lesmahago and renewed the National Covenant and the Solemn League and Covenant amidst solemn scenes of mourning over past sins and earnest dedication of themselves to faithfulness to the Lord. Alexander Shields, their minister, preached from Deuteronomy 26:16, "This day the Lord thy God hath commanded thee to do these statutes and judgments. Thou shalt therefore keep and do them with all thine heart and with all thy soul." The United Societies had never hesitated to bear arms at their meetings, and this large gathering, fully armed, underlined that their military strength was now considerable, especially in their heartlands in the southwest. So the Covenanters were making their position clear, and it remained to be seen how the Scottish nation would respond. So the Convention of Estates gathered in a very tense situation, with a very real prospect of civil war on the horizon. Edinburgh Castle had its batteries trained on Parliament House, where the convention was to meet, and Edinburgh Castle was still being held for the exiled King James by the Duke of Gordon. The Jacobite peers, Lord Balcarres, and the bloody persecutor of the Covenants, Graham of Claverhouse, who was now a peer himself as Viscount Dundee, attended the convention with a letter of authority from the exiled King James. The 9 Scottish bishops were also entitled to take their seats in this gathering. They were of a very different stamp from the English bishops, they owed their position entirely to James. They were his personal appointees, and therefore they were entirely loyal to him. The convention's first duty was to elect a president, and William's candidate was the Duke of Hamilton, who was Scotland's principal peer. He was opposed by the Marquis of Athol, who was proposed as the candidate of the Jacobite party. However, it's quite a remarkable fact of history. Neither of these men were true partisans. They were politicians, and they were very carefully hedging their bets. In both cases, these two peers, the Duke of Hamilton and the Marquis of Athol, had also their elder son as a member of the convention as well. So in each case, the elder son joined the opposing party to their father to ensure that whoever ultimately triumphed and came out on top, their noble house would not lose its status. So it underlines that these nobles were very much opportunistic politicians who were cautiously finding their course through this situation, but certainly there were many others who were much, much more passionate and committed in their views. So the vote was taken between the two candidates, and the Duke of Hamilton was elected president, underlining that the Williamites seemed to have the upper hand. What followed was the reading of the two letters, one letter from King William, the other letter from King James. William's letter was a cautious conciliatory document in which he offered his rule to the Scottish nation. By contrast, James's letter was typical of all of the failings of the Stuart kings. It was full of royal prerogatives. It threatened charges of treason against those who opposed him, and this letter therefore proved deeply damaging to James's cause. The secular historian William Ferguson has written, "This alarmed the waverers among the Episcopalians, who feared that in the event of James's restoration, their natural allegiance would be made to cover not just the king's majesty, but also the spiritual claims of the Pope. Rightly, this episode has been regarded as the main determinant of the course followed by the convention. At a stroke, his stupid letter reduced James's active sympathisers in the estates to a relatively small body of committed Jacobites, of whom the chief was Viscount Dundee." So after these initial discussions, it was clear that few, other than the old Episcopalian bishops, were determined partisans for James, and that would prove crucial for the future. The leaders of the Episcopalian Church in Scotland were aligning themselves firmly with the exiled king. Episcopalianism was being allied to Jacobitism in Scotland, and that therefore would have a crucial bearing upon the future of episcopacy north of the border. By contrast, those of even moderately Presbyterian sympathy were firmly allied to William of Orange. Once Viscount Dundee realised that there was no prospect of success in the convention, he left the gathering and headed north to raise an army in the Highlands for James. So the Jacobites who remained in the convention were few and leaderless, and William's supporters had their way. So on the 4th of April, the convention declared the throne of Scotland vacant. By his misrule, James was deemed to have forfeited the crown. Interestingly, that same day, the United Societies made a direct show of force in Edinburgh itself, mustering and parading with arms in the Grassmarket to indicate their military strength in opposition to the Jacobites. On the 11th of April, the convention formally decided to offer the crown to William and Mary jointly. The terms of the offer were enacted in the Claim of Right, a hugely important piece of Scottish constitutional legislation. It rejected the supremacy that the Stuart kings had claimed over the law of the land, limited the power of the monarch over Parliament, and in particular condemned episcopacy as a great and insupportable grievance and burden to this nation. So you see how a condemnation of episcopacy is going alongside the rejection of James's rule. So with the lines of the conflict becoming clearer, the Covenanters were prepared to take arms in defence of William's kingship and of the Claim of Right. So that same month, the Earl of Angus raised a regiment of 1,200 of these Covenanters, these from the more hard line, from the United Societies, called the Cameronians. in memory of their martyred minister, Richard Cameron, to fight for William. On the 11th of May, William accepted the terms of the claim of right, with the provision only that he was not going to be a religious persecutor. So Scotland had a new king and queen. With the Crown settled, a full Scottish Parliament met and rapidly began to reform the Scottish Church. On 26th of May, the Westminster Confession was approved as the basis of faith for the Church, and on 22nd July, episcopacy was formally abolished. All of this left the Jacobites weakened and divided. The Marquis of Atholl, who had been the political leader, acquiesced and wrote to William to assure him of his allegiance. The Duke of Gordon surrendered Edinburgh Castle. Lord Balcarres submitted to imprisonment. But Viscount Dundee had gathered his forces in the Highlands, and he began to advance south with a Highland army in defence of the Jacobite cause. So the long brewing conflict at last erupted on the 27th of July at the Battle of Killiecrankie in Perthshire. The Highland Jacobites won a rapid victory over the Williamite forces, who were led by General Hugh Mackay of Scourie. So the Jacobites had won, but it was a hollow victory, because in the battle, Claverhouse himself had been mortally wounded, shot through the breastplate. The Jacobites therefore had won, but were left without a leader. But for Edinburgh, the situation was now dangerous. A Jacobite army was bearing down upon them, and the Privy Council therefore made plans to leave Scotland, and they ordered the new Cameronian regiment to proceed immediately to Dunkeld, with orders to hold back the Jacobite advance at all costs. On the 21st of August, an army of 5,000 Highland Jacobites assailed Dunkeld. The Cameronians only had 800 men in the field, and Dunkeld offered them little protection. It had no city wall. The Cameronians therefore took up their positions in the cathedral and in the mansion of Lord Atholl. The Jacobites attacked from all sides. The Cameronian colonel was killed in the first hour, and the major was wounded, so it was left to a mere captain, George Munro, to lead the defence. The battle went on for 16 hours. At last, the Cameronians were actually stripping the lead off the roof of Atholl House to make musket balls so that they could keep on firing, and yet they were able to continue to do so. At 11 o'clock that night, the exhausted Jacobites, out of ammunition, at last withdrew from the fight and began to retreat north. The town, and by extension the south of Scotland, had been held for William, and it was the Cameronians, these most hardline Covenanters, who had won the victory for him. The Glorious Revolution and the Protestant succession would have been seriously endangered for Scotland without the Cameronian defence of Parliament, and the victory at Dunkeld, which in the words of Ian Cowan, secured the Protestant Revolution in Scotland. In the latter part of 1689 and throughout 1690, the process of reform of the church continued at a local level. In the Covenanting heartlands, the Episcopalian curates were ejected from their churches and manses. This was harsh, but it was not brutal. This was not a reverse persecution in terms of the killing times. No one was tortured, no one was killed. By law, ministers were obliged to pray for William and Mary, and those who refused could lawfully be expelled from their charges, and therefore what was being done, though rather chaotic and disorderly, was in accordance with civil law. By the 7th of November 1689, 182 of the curates had been lawfully dispossessed for this reason. Throughout Scotland, Presbyterianism was associated with loyalty to William, and episcopacy with loyalty to James. There was one commission formed for north of the Tay and another commission formed for south of the Tay. But in accordance with Presbyterian principles, it very largely depended upon the character of the locality. In the Covenanting heartlands of Ayrshire and Dumfriesshire, the Episcopalian curate's position was wholly untenable, and they had to leave or to conform to Presbyterianism. But further north, there were many of the Episcopalians who were able to retain possession of their charges, and it was therefore a very varied picture across the course of the country. Many of the Episcopalians professed conversion to Presbyterian principles and were therefore admitted into the church. The General Assembly, the Revolution Church of Scotland, finally gathered in October and November of 1690. The membership of the Assembly was elderly. It was considered to be the direct continuation of the Great Ejection Church of Scotland. So the Church of Scotland as it existed in 1662. So it was elderly ministers such as Thomas Hogg of Kiltern who formed the backbone of this gathering. They were, however, willing to admit others, and therefore Episcopalians who convinced them of their conversion to Presbyterianism were admitted. Similarly, the three ministers of the United Societies, Shields, Lining and Boyd, were all admitted as ministers of the Church of Scotland by the General Assembly. So, as a result, this General Assembly was in great measure incorporating and including Scotland's Protestants within its bounds, and ultimately the great majority of them did enter the Revolution Church of Scotland. It's not therefore accurate to say that the Covenanters declined to enter the Church of Scotland at the Revolution. In fact, that's really based upon a false definition of the Covenanters. The Covenanters really were the Revolution Church of 1690. They were the direct descendants, in many cases, the actual individuals who had maintained Covenanting principles in the 1640s and 1650s. However, it is true that a hard line of the United Societies, though loyal to William and Mary, were not prepared to enter the Revolution Church, and they maintained a presence in the southwest, particularly of Scotland, in the decades that followed, albeit without any minister over them for the 20 years or so following this. So on the one hand, some of the hardline Covenanters refused to enter. On the other hand, of course, the more determined Episcopalians, who were almost uniformly Jacobites, refused also to associate with this church, and they maintained also a separate existence, which eventually would be formalised from 1712 as the Scottish Episcopal Church. But one could argue that politically and theologically, these were the far extremes of Scottish Protestantism on one side and on the other, and that the Revolution Church did in large measure incorporate Scottish Protestantism into one church. To what extent did they maintain the principles of the National Covenant? That, I suppose, is the most challenging question of all. Certainly, it is quite clear that they accepted the limitations of the possible. They recognised that a Presbyterian settlement was not about to be imposed on England, and that there was no prospect of William and Mary themselves fully embracing a Presbyterian principles or of them taking the covenants. So there was an acceptance that a Presbyterian settlement would only refer to Scotland, where it was the will of the people, that it could not be imposed upon the Church of England. There was a recognition that the Scots could not impose upon the English Parliament covenanting principles, so the English bishops would retain their seats in the House of Lords, for example. So there was an acceptance of the limitations of the possible, but there was also a ready embrace of the opportunity that had presented itself to secure a Presbyterian settlement for the Church of Scotland going forward. And therefore, in the view of the vast majority of Scottish Presbyterians, the principles of the Covenant were maintained and enshrined in the Revolution settlement that was achieved. Thank you.
Very much indeed, Alasdair. Now, comments, questions?
This may reveal my abysmal ignorance, but why does the massacre of Glencoe fit into this picture?
Certainly. The massacre of Glencoe was essentially, it was shortly after this period, I think 1694, although I'm pulling that out of my memory. That was William and Mary attempting to extend their power into the Highlands, which up until then had largely been Jacobite, and they were requiring, therefore, the peers, the clan chiefs of the Highlands, to swear allegiance to the new king, to William and Mary, and to their rule. So the massacre of Glencoe occurred when one particular clan chief, MacIan, was, shall we say, reluctant to take that oath. He did eventually take it, but he took it too late, and therefore there were bloody reprisals as the Campbell Redcoats assaulted his lands and massacred many of his people. It was a rather chaotic event, and it did the Scottish government of the time no favours in the eyes of the people. It was seen as having been unduly ruthless, but it was part of this process of the Highlands being subjugated and being expected to give their loyalty to William and Mary. But of course, as we know from later history, Jacobite sentiment remained very strong in the Highlands until after the 1745 Rising.
Yes.
What's the position of the Dalrymples of Stair at that time?
They were supportive of William and Mary. Stair was arguably the principal peer in terms of William's administration in the 1690s, and he was therefore more responsible than any other for the action that occurred at Glencoe in 1694. But it would be fair to say that that would be considered an exceptional measure. It certainly was not something that was replicated elsewhere, and in other respects, William's rule in Scotland was characterised by caution and moderation.
Yeah.
Is it, to what extent was the power of the MacDonalds of Glencoe, which was extensive at the time, and their associations with France, part of the downfall?
Yeah, obviously there was a concern at the extent of Jacobite sympathy within the Highlands. James had fled to France and had support there from the French crown. France was hesitating to throw its weight fully behind him because the French did not want to provoke a full-scale war with Britain at that time, but he certainly had extensive support. And the fear was therefore that James would be able to bring about a Jacobite rising in the Highlands, which would then raise support from the north of the country, while a French naval invasion further south would bring about a sort of a pincer movement and ultimately secure the British crown by force of arms for James once more. So that was the fear. And as we recognise from later history, it was not altogether an unfounded fear. Clearly, there were many Jacobites in the Highlands who were prepared to rise for James in 1715 and 1745. So it certainly wasn't altogether a misguided perception of events.
As an important set constitutional settlement, Scotland made a reappearance recently in the prolongation of Parliament cases. And in particular, I think the differences between the claim of right in Scotland and the Bill of Rights in England. What are the key differences between the two?
That, I think, would be a more specialised question than I would care to venture an answer on here. But certainly there are, shall we say, distinctions between the Scottish and the English political settlement. And it would be fair to say that these reflect a different view of the rights and prerogatives of the people versus the crown, which is part of Scotland's longer-term constitutional heritage and arguably extends right back to the Declaration of Arbroath and other such documents. But it's really a whole other subject in its own right. An interesting one, but a whole other subject.
I was searching independence occasionally. I came across a man, William MacLeod, who was a very enthusiastic missionary. How do you hear independence? Decided to have a wee look at background. And it led me back to John MacLeod. And I've often thought that one of the streams that fed in national independence, the outing, the position of given that period go on 100 years and you're still feeling it out of it. So it's not just a matter of the helpings, setting up new churches. There are others. So that's my point. Especially with a question which possibly swept not you. We're just popular covenanting. I attended lectures of Ian Fowler in class, and I remember this article of the Cowan view of covenanters, paired with fair sunshine of Jock Purvis and the army of pro-covenanter romantic writers. How does that fit? Is it right out?
Yeah, there's certainly been a revisionist movement that has, shall we say, challenged the romantic view of the Covenanters as uncomplicated martyrs. And rightly so. There unquestionably was a real political edge to the Covenanters. And while they were courageous in defense of their own rights, no one can deny that they would have been equally resolute in denying rights to others had they secured the primacy. Which is why William's insistence that he would not adopt persecuting principles in accepting a Presbyterian settlement in Scotland was so significant. So I think it is fair that we recognise that the importance of that revisionist view, we recognise that it has, shall we say, complicated the picture, but in a helpful way. That shifts us from uncomplicated admiration to a more nuanced appreciation of the stand of the Covenanters. It does not undermine our admiration for their courage, their boldness in the face of death. It does not mean that we cannot admire and respect their stand and even agree with it to an extent. But we can recognise that there was more going on than a sort of defence of religious liberty. It was a much more sharp-edged position than that, if I can put it like that. Yeah. Indeed. If I could maybe come back to your comment, which was very helpful. I thought that was a useful observation. One point I would make is that the Covenanters had already shown during the 17th century the capacity and the willingness of the Scottish people to join in separate worship, to separate from the parish kirk when they were dissatisfied with what was being said and done there, and to come to conventicles, open air meetings, private house meetings, and to find spiritual food there. So there certainly had been that that precedent set through these covenanting times. And I think that certainly fed into the response to the patronage controversy of the 18th century, in which in various ways individual churches and in some cases whole denominations separated, seceded from the Church of Scotland and maintained a separate existence, and then later Congregationalist and Baptist churches as well. And certainly all of that, I think, would be fed to some degree by the same attitude of the Covenanters, denouncing the conformity and the softly approach of the local curate and demanding something a bit harder edged and meatier from their preachers. Yeah.
I'm just wondering there, Alasdair, as well, talking about, in one sense, the Covenanting movement setting up these little precedents that developed into others. Would you see that also as being setting up precedents for things like the praying societies of the 18th, 19th centuries and so on, through which the more evangelical revival was able to come, when sometimes it was blocked in the official churches and the official worship? But in the praying societies, they had a much freer approach in that. I suppose that these would all feed together.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. Yes, I think that's a very helpful observation. And again, that would come from that same point of principle, that willingness to critique, even to reject what was provided by the state church, that willingness to stand apart from it, to gather with those who were felt to be of a like mind, and to seek that unity, to seek a way forward that would allow such principles to be promoted. I think you would see it even in the disruption itself, that same principle being developed, but certainly the praying societies, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, any more comments, questions, or great insights there? Right, that's great. Alasdair, thank you so much for a tremendous talk, a very engaging talk, and a very enlightening talk. And I'm sure that each part of it could be fleshed out even more, with even greater light shown there. So thank you very much indeed. Now we are running ahead of time, which is fantastic for a conference. So I'm looking, where's Mark about at the back? There's Mark. We're scheduled to have tea and coffee until 11:30. Will we just keep that schedule? 40 minutes. Okay. Yes, has been started. We reconvene 11:30 on the dot. Thank you very much.
Thank you.